Hello and welcome to the very last video of the semester. This one in particular taking a look at the article I asked you to read that examined gamification in an educational context. First off, I want you to understand what gamification actually is, and I thought comparing it to an actual game might give you some context for that. So when we talk about games, we're talking about scenarios that have rules that the user or participant has to understand in order to fully participate. There are specific objectives behind the game, which in an educational context could also relate to curricular objectives as well as objectives that are specific to the game itself. And then with regard to a game, it's possible that the participant can lose. So there might not just be a single winner or a single loser, but it's possible that the learner is not going to be able to complete all of the objectives effectively. So gamification then is when principles of games are tapped into in situations that are not typically game types of situations. So in a classroom context, for example, gamification can be used to try to motivate learners to engage in the curriculum, participate, and so on. So you can establish a gamification or a gamified class by employing some of the principles. So gamification is based on a lot of theories about the way people learn. So it's kind of rooted in psychology and not education. And there are several principles that steer the gamification process. So one primary one is the idea of setting goals and that the learner has to be willing to work toward completion of the goal. The capacity to overcome challenges, so the learner is aware that he or she might not know everything up front and that they have to maybe learn things to be able to experience progress within the situation. Typically, feedback is provided that can take on a lot of different characteristics. It could be just you're right or wrong. It could be they could accrue points and so on, but basically feedback is provided along the way, and often that's where technology might play a viable role that would be difficult to implement without the technology. In addition, reinforcement is part of gamification, gaining rewards, again tying back to the concept of points. It might be embedded in this concept of reinforcement. Progress is typically displayed in a way where individuals can see how they fit compared to other participants, so where they stack up. And that can be both a positive thing, and it can also be a somewhat negative thing, as we can see in the study for this week. Often there's some type of social connectivity. It could be that participants are engaged at the same time. It could be and interacting with each other. So it could be text-based. It could be that they are using live audio feedback to engage with each other. It can take on a lot of different kinds of roles. And then really rooted in any kind of game is the idea that it is something that ought to be fun for the individuals who are participating. So the idea of embedding it into an educational setting is that games typically are fun for the learners. So if we can engage the learner in something that he or she finds more fun than maybe writing a paper or reading a book, that they might learn the content better than if we didn't implement the game. The authors were very adamant that they we're not just interested in understanding whether gamification in the classroom just simply produced changes in outcomes or differences in outcomes between those who participated in the gamified class versus those who are not in that class. They actually wanted to explore some of the principles behind gamification, so they tried to isolate variables in a way that allowed them to do that type of exploration. So they actually had 6 hypotheses that they examined. They looked at how users in the gamified course compared themselves to others, meaning did they look at the leaderboard? They looked at motivation levels between those who were in the gamified and non-gamified courses. They looked at satisfaction with the course. They looked at the amount of effort that students in both courses were perceiving to give. They looked at empowerment, perception of empowerment over the students who were in both classes. And then they also hypothesized that the students who were more intrinsically motivated with regard to the course and course content in general, that itself had an impact on their final exam scores. So they actually used the term mediate, which is it's kind of a statistical related term that suggests that there are factors outside of the outcome of interest that influence that outcome of interest beyond what's being examined specifically. So in this case, they were examining participation in the gamified class. So that was the variable that they were really testing, but they were saying that it's not necessarily that variable itself that impacts final test score, but rather how intrinsically motivated the learner was to understand the content. So just a couple things about the results to help you as you're reading. They talk about, with regard to testing each of the hypotheses, that video game use was not a significant covariate. The word covariate is something that signifies that it's a measure being used to potentially even out groups that are not similar to begin with. And because students self-selected into one section or the other of the course, the authors were interested in understanding if the use of video games as the college students were both younger and currently might be something that impacts their enjoyment, their motivation, and a variety of things that could potentially contribute to performance on the final exam. So the video game, they wanted to understand if it made a difference in terms of the one group compared to the other group, and they basically found that there was no difference between the groups in terms of their use of video gaming. And then they also talked about, in several cases, interactions between things. So an interaction would be if we looked at just the impact of time on something. So they gave measures 4 times over the course of the semester. So did the outcome change from time 1 to time 2, from time 2 to time 3, and so on? And then condition would be, were they in the gamified class or not? And then the interaction between the two means if we look at just time by itself, that might give us a different outcome than if we looked at the combination of time and condition. So it's possible that those who were in the gamified class had different outcomes at time 1, time 2, and time 3 than the students who were not in the gamified class. So it's the interaction just means that they're looking at the two variables together and not just individually. So they do talk about that the interaction effects were not significant in some cases, but they were significant in other cases. And to know whether something is significant, and I know I've talked about this earlier in the semester, we're looking really at the p-values. If the p-value is less than 0.05, then we know that there is a difference between the groups. They do report other values as well. They might get a little bit overwhelming for those of you who either are not in the quantitative class right now or who haven't already taken it. So if you can just look at the p-values for now, I think that'll be sufficient. And then the last thing that I wanted to draw to your attention was the graphic that they have, which shows the path models between intrinsic motivation, the course type, so either the gamified or the non-gamified, and then performance on the final exam score. The relationship between course type and intrinsic motivation was statistically significant. That's what the asterisk here denotes. And then the relationship between intrinsic motivation and final exam score was also statistically significant. The relationship between course type and final exam score was not statistically significant. So what the authors were basically finding is that there are different features embedded within gamification, i.e. how it impacts motivation, that is a greater influence on final exam score than the course type itself. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more background behind principles that are embedded in the study and what the authors chose to examine. I hope you find the study to be interesting. I certainly did. And certainly the concepts of being able to employ some of the principles of gamification into a classroom setting with technology is just something for you to consider. And I think the article reveals some things, especially in the review of literature, that might give you some food for thought. Enjoy!